Welcome back to the show. So there's this concept that Hamas uses civilians as a human shield. And that is the excuse that the IDF uses for blowing up civilian areas inside of Gaza and attacking in other Palestinian areas. And so I wanted to take the time to debunk this a bit, because this is a commonly held belief. Even those who totally are against the IDF, they're against what they're doing. Even people who are more pro-Palestinian, trying to help the Palestinian people, sympathetic to the Palestinians, even they believe that there is this concept of using civilians as a human shield. And so what I'll often see on social media is, well, I don't agree with Hamas doing this, but, and then they'll kind of make their claim as to why the IDF and Israel and how they're behaving is bad, right? So they'll kind of go down that path. But they still believe that Hamas uses civilians as a human shield. And we're going to debunk that tonight. We're going to show you how that is not only not true, but it's actually exactly the opposite. In fact, it is the Israelis who use Palestinians as human shields and not the other way around, to a level that is unfortunately going to just make your stomach churn. One of the reasons why they're able to get away with this narrative is the ignorance of the West. So a lot of people in the West believe that if you're Muslim, you must be a jihadist. And if you're a jihadist, you're willing to blow up children, right? So that is kind of the line of reasoning that those who claim that Hamas uses civilians as a human shield are hoping you're going to connect that you're going to go down that path of, well, they are these radical Muslims, and we all know radical Muslims are jihadists, and jihadists will strap bombs to their own children and send them into buildings. So yes, they must be using these people as human shields. That is playing on the ignorance that you don't know the difference between Islam and even very devout Islam, which is what I would say Hamas represents, a very, very, very conservative, very right-wing, very conservative faction of Islam for sure. They're like the Iranians, different type of Muslim. Iranians are Shia Muslims and Hamas is Sunni, but they're similar in the way that they're extremely devout and want to live a very, very devout life, a very, very conservative life. However, there is a difference between being very devout and being the type of Islam, what we would call a Salafist, right? So that is where Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they stem from this, and Taliban, they stem from a different type of Islam. It's a different faction of Islam that has different beliefs. And that is where we're seeing that real radical human, using children, using women, using all these people. And they say, well, you're doing it and you're going to get rewarded by God in the afterlife. So it's fine. You can die today. You'll be rewarded tomorrow. That is a different type of Islam and a different type of ideology. And they bank on your ignorance of not knowing. Hamas actually, inside of Gaza, fights the radicals. So, I mean, look, I believe like if you're that religious, you're kind of a radical, right? But you're just super, super, super devout, and it's not my thing. But it is different than being an actual Islamist, a radical Islamist, which is different than Islam. So the radicals in Gaza include factions of Al-Qaeda, factions of ISIS. Hamas, which is the democratically elected government of Gaza, not a terrorist organization. They're not an organization like ISIS or Taliban or Al-Qaeda. They are a political party that was democratically elected, by the way, to represent the people of Gaza. They just are a very, very right-wing political party. So they fight actively against Al-Qaeda and ISIS inside of Gaza. So they are a government that is fighting against those radical groups. But they bank on you, people that say these things bank on you not knowing any of this. And they bank on you thinking that Hamas and equating Hamas to groups like Taliban, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, when Hamas is not like that at all. Hamas is it's just a political party. And you can agree with that political party like you are a Democrat or a Republican, or you don't. And Hamas just happens to be a far right, very, very ultra conservative political party. Okay. And so then what about these missiles and all this stuff? Well, yeah, because they are the elected government of Gaza. They control the de facto military of Gaza. The de facto military includes weapons that they are able to secure through whatever means they secure it. So again, it's like Trump had the codes to the nukes and now Biden does. So whichever government, whichever political party is in power, they control the military. That is Hamas. Right now, Hamas controls the de facto military for Gaza. They're not allowed to have a military. And this is also one thing to keep in mind with this human shield concept. So Hamas, Palestinians in general are disarmed. They're not allowed, they don't have the right to bear arms, and they're not allowed a military. So if you're Hamas, if you're or any political group that's been elected in Gaza, and you don't have the right to have a military, if you want a military, you have to hide that military. You can't just go and build military installations. You can't have bases. They'll be blown up in 2 seconds. You have to hide them. Where are you going to hide them? Well, you're probably going to intermix them within the civilians, right? Because it's a guerrilla type army. It's guerrilla warfare for you. You're not allowed to participate in the rules of engagement like other nations. So Hamas, when they are accused of human shielding, they say that's bullcrap. We don't use anybody as a human shield, not to the way you think of human shield. And they say, yeah, we participate in like underground kind of guerrilla warfare where we hide our weapons, right? Yeah, and we hide our weapons in places that are inside of the populated areas, because where else are we going to hide them? If we take them and put them in a military base away from civilians, you people will blow them up in 2 seconds because we're not technically allowed to have it. So you see their conundrum, their dilemma, right? But when I think of a human shield, I think of you're literally telling, you're taking a person, holding them essentially hostage against their will, or even maybe they've agreed to it, and you're putting them in harm's way for the greater good, right? For the cause of the greater good. You're saying, well, I'm going to, this is because we're fighting a war and you're going to sacrifice yourself for this war, or I'm going to force you to sacrifice yourself for this war. That is a human shield. So let's go over some of the times. This is an article that this is Wikipedia, so, take it or leave it. But I think it's a really good resource for this. It says right here, under the concept of human shield, here's Palestine. Says, let me try to zoom in on this for you guys. And it goes through various different areas, but here is Palestine. In the British Mandate of Palestine, Arab civilians and insurgents were captured by the British as prisoners of war during the Great Palestinian Revolt. They were frequently taken and placed on pony trucks on which hostages could be made to sit, and those were placed at the front of the trains to deter other insurgents from detonating explosives on the railways. So they used captured Palestinians and they tied them up onto pony trucks, and they were forced to sit there so that their side of the fight wouldn't blow them up. That is a human shield. That's the actual literal definition of a human shield. You're using them to shield yourself from harm's way. That was going on in the British Mandate of Palestine. So that was quite early. So we're talking, after World War I, in between World War I and World War II, that was going on. Now it goes on here to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It says right here, according to many observers, including B'Tselem, which is a Jewish organization, the IDF repeatedly used Palestinians as human shields. This practice became military policy during the Second Intifada and was only dropped when Adallah challenged the practice before Israel's High Court of Justice in 2002. Though the IDF persisted in using Palestinians in its neighbor procedure, whereby people picked at random were made to approach the houses of suspects and persuade them to surrender, a practice which arguably placed the former's life in danger. So if you're the IDF military, what you do is you grab a Palestinian and you're going to go and invade this guy's house because you think this guy is like Hamas, right? So you'd grab a random Palestinian off the street, you'd capture him, and you'd say, you go in there first, and we're going to follow behind you. Or you're going to go knock on his door and tell him to surrender, and we're going to be holding our guns to your back, and he's probably going to be holding a gun to your face because you're in between us. That is a human shield. Goes on here. During the Second Intifada, according to Israeli defense officials, the Israel Defense Forces made use of the human shield procedure on 1,200 occasions during the Second Intifada, which was from 2000 to 2005. And only on one occasion did a Palestinian civilian get hurt, thank God. According to human rights groups, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, The Israeli Defense Forces used Palestinian civilians as human shields during the 2002 Battle of Jenin. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem said that for a long period of time following the outbreak of the Second Intifada, particularly during Operation Defensive Shield in April 2002, the IDF systematically used Palestinian civilians as human shields, forcing them to carry out military actions which threatened their lives. So they would literally use them as human shields. Said that in 2002, the Supreme Court of Israel issued a temporary injunction banning the practice. So they tried to ban it in the Supreme Court of Israel. So they admitted to it. This wasn't like under the radar. This was well known. The Supreme Court had to get involved. And they said that they were trying to ban the practice in the wake of a death. It was Nadal Abu Mohsen, 19 years old, who was shot dead when he was forced by the IDF to knock on the door of his neighbor, Hamas militant Nasser Jarrar, in the West Bank village of Tubas, and inform him of the Israeli army's demands that he surrender. And then he was shot dead. In 2004, a 13-year-old boy, Mohammed Badwan, was photographed tied to an Israeli police vehicle in the West Bank village of Bidu, being used as a shield to deter stone-throwing protesters. Could you imagine? So you want to prevent protesting, so you just tie one of the protesters up on your car and drive around. And then there was a rabbi who tried to intervene. You know, not all, in a lot of Israeli Jews see all this that goes on, and they get involved and they say, oh no, you know, this is not okay. So Rabbi Eric Asherman was placed under arrest after he tried to intervene in what these guys were doing. It says here in 2005, while acknowledging and defending the use of Palestinians to deliver warnings to wanted men about impending arrest operations, a practice known in Israel by the euphemism neighbor procedure, the IDF denied reports of using Palestinians as human shields against attacks on IDF forces, claiming it had already forbidden this practice. In 2006, however, initial investigations by B'Tselem indicated that the IDF might have used civilians as human shields in 2006. In February 2007, the footage was released of an incident involving Sema Amira, a 24-year-old Palestinian who video showed serving as a human shield for a group of Israeli soldiers getting inside apartments suspected to belong to Palestinian militants ahead of the soldiers. A 15-year-old cousin of Amira and an 11-year-old girl in the West Bank independently told B'Tselem in February 2007 that Israeli soldiers forced each of them in separate incidents to open the door of a neighboring apartment belonging to a suspected militant, get inside ahead of them, open doors and windows. What the hell? 15 and 11-year-old little girl? And you say, go in there and open up the doors and open all the windows? 11-year-old girl? Are you kidding me? That is using somebody as a human shield. During the 2008-2009 Gaza war, known as Operation Cast-Lead, Israeli military forces were accused of continuing to use civilians as human shields by Amnesty International and Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence is an organization comprised of former IDF soldiers who were traumatized by what they were forced to do while serving in the IDF, and now they have an organization. According to the testimonies published by these two groups, Israeli forces used unarmed Palestinians, including children, to protect military positions, walk in front of armed soldiers, go into buildings to check for booby traps or gunmen, and inspect suspicious objects for explosives. Are you kidding me? Amnesty International stated that it found cases in which Israeli troops forced Palestinians to stay in one room of their home while turning the rest of the house into a base and sniper position, effectively using the families, both adults and children, as human shields and putting them at risk. The Guardian compiled 3 videos and testimony from civilians about alleged war crimes committed by Israeli soldiers during the 2008-2009 Gaza war, including the use of Palestinian children as human shields. In the videos, 3 teenage brothers from the Al-Attar family claimed that they were forced at gunpoint to kneel in front of tanks to deter Hamas fighters from firing at them, and that they were used to clear houses for the Israeli soldiers. The Israeli soldiers, they don't care. There was that one journalist who was run over by a tank. She was trying to stop them from demolishing a house, and they ran her over and killed her. An IDF soldier's testimony for Breaking the Silence told that his commander ordered that for every house raided by the IDF, they send a neighbor to go in before the soldier, sometimes while the soldier placed his gun on the neighbor's shoulder. That is a human shield. On March 12, 2010, the Israeli Defense Forces prosecution filed indictments against 2 staff sergeants at the Givati Brigade for forcing a 9-year-old Palestinian boy to open a number of bags they thought might contain explosives in January 2009. Who are these people? This is like, when you hear about the Nuremberg trials, right? And it was, you should have known better, right? Maybe you were commanded to do this, but you should have known better and you shouldn't have done it. You should have said, no, I draw the line because I have personal moral ethics. I'm not going to force a 9-year-old to open a bunch of bags I think contain explosives. No, I'm morally against that. The boy told he was hit by the soldiers and forced to work for them at gunpoint. In the 2009-2014 Gaza war, in an interview with Breaking the Silence, a former Israeli soldier recounted that the commander of his unit employed the policy despite acknowledging its ban, as he would rather that a Palestinian civilian be killed carrying out the duty than one of his men. He told young Palestinian boys were also used by this particular unit to carry out military duties for the Israeli army. This was in 2013. So it's, this is like getting closer and closer to now. Defense for Children International Palestine reported 17-year-old Ahmad Abdu-Raida was kidnapped by Israeli soldiers who, after beating him up and threatening him at times with sexual overtones, used him as a human shield for 5 days, forcing him to walk in front of them with police dogs at gunpoint, search houses, and dig in places soldiers suspected there might be tunnels. Palestinian Arabs, it says right here, Israeli writer Amos Haral in Haaretz alleged that during the Second Intifada, Palestinian gunmen routinely used civilians and children as human shields, and further alleges that there's photographic evidence. So now we're seeing the other side of this, right? So not just the Israeli, but the Palestinian side. Let's talk about what they do. On 22nd of November, Human Rights Watch, however, accused Mohammed Wael Baroud, a military commander in the Popular Resistance Committee, of using civilians for shielding homes against military attacks, but later stated that they erred. There was no evidence that the house was being used for military purposes at the time of the planned attack, nor did the IDF explain what military objective it could have had. It says here that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated Hamas now regularly uses human shields to protect the homes of Hamas officials. The Israeli Intelligence and Terrorism Information Center accused Hamas and other arms groups of making extensive use of human shields as integral parts of their war doctrine in order to prevent the IDF to target them. The IDF released footage allegedly showing Palestinian fighters using ambulances for military purposes. Megan David Adam, the Israeli Ambulance and Medical Emergency Service, submitted to the UN a report concluding the accusation was unfounded. The United Nations fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict that took place in 2008-2009 accepted the possibility that Hamas launched mortar attacks from the vicinity of a school and from residential homes, sometimes by the threat of force against residents. The report was unable to find specific evidence that civilians whose homes were used for rocket launches were forced to remain in their houses. But the report repeatedly noted that Gaza residents were reluctant to discuss the conduct of Palestinian armed forces due to fear of reprisals. In an exhaustive post-invasion analysis of Israeli claims, Amnesty International stated that, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. It found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters, nor that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. So you see, there's no evidence whatsoever that Hamas uses human shields. At best, you could say, well, they use human shields because they use ambulances to cart around weapons, and they use, tunnels underground civilian buildings. But like I mentioned, Hamas is not allowed military installations. They're not allowed bases. That's not something they can do. So if they want to have any weapons at all, they do have to hide them. However, and that is dangerous. It's obviously extremely dangerous for the people involved. But the Palestinians will tell you, and the reason why they keep voting in Hamas is because they say their lives are dangerous no matter what. Either way, they have to fight back. That's what they say. They say we have to fight back. We can't just allow ourselves to be ethnically cleansed. and just take it, and just say, well, I guess we're being ethnically cleansed. I guess there's nothing we can do. I guess we'll just go for it. Go ahead and go along with it. They say, no, we have to fight back. So they fight back, and they understand the risk of fighting back. Israeli soldiers, however, tying people up to police cars, forcing 9-year-old girls to go in before them, using people to knock on doors of suspects. That is actually the technical definition of human shields, of using human shields. So I wanted to kind of clarify all of this regarding human shields, regarding Hamas. I am not making any excuses for Hamas. I definitely am not a fan. I'm not a fan of any group that is hyper religious, hyper right wing, ultra conservative, right? I would never want to live there, and I wouldn't want to subject anybody else to living there if they didn't want to. But if you want to, by all means, it's up to you. It's your life. Live how you want. But that being said, there is a difference between Hamas and jihadists. There's a difference between Hamas and Salafist organizations such as Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And there is a difference between strapping bombs to children that we've seen in other terrorist attacks to Hamas being a democratically elected, whether you like it or not, a political party, and what they do, hiding and stuff. There's a difference between that and actual human shielding. So I wanted to kind of clarify all of that, bring that up for you, give you more of the facts about that in my view, it's very much projecting. The Israelis say, you're using them as human shields. You're using them as human shields. And meanwhile, they're the ones who've been using them as human shields. So that's where they got the idea, because they're doing it. And then they're saying, oh, no, you're doing it. You're doing it. It's you. And really, there's no actual evidence of Hamas doing this, but there is a lot of evidence of the Israelis having done this. And that is why they're now accusing Hamas of doing it, because they realize, how hard people went after them for doing it and how it's a war crime. And so they're like, well, they're doing a war crime. See what they're doing when they're not actually doing it. Wanted to clarify that for you guys. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. Please be sure, if you would like to support this channel, the best way to do it is to become a member of my locals community. That link is down below. That is where you can definitely continue to support this show so that we can remain on the air, doing these deep dives, discussing all of the important topics that are going on. So I really definitely appreciate that. Thank you guys for being here. Tomorrow we will talk a lot about what is going on regarding the vaccine and COVID and treatments and stuff. So I will definitely be sharing with you guys where you can catch that show, because it might not be where you're watching now, depending, because you know how censorship works. So